It was a rainy Friday evening when I hit the dirt roads that led up to my usual hiking trail. The week had been long and work had been stressful. I wanted nothing more than to escape into the wilderness for the whole weekend, and that's what I had set out to do. I wasn't a big hunter of any kind, really, though there had been the occasional outing where I actually had brought my hunting equipment up. I always found it difficult to actually pull that trigger when the time came. This particular outing, I had brought some stuff with me, but only because I knew I wanted to try and stay out until Sunday evening. My camping equipment was all knitted up in the back seat, along with my hunting rifle, just in case I encountered some less than friendly animals when I was out there. The first sign that something was wrong up on this mountain came only a short distance from where I had parked my vehicle. With my gear on my back and the rain not letting up, I almost didn't notice it at first, until I damn near kicked the thing. Half tucked into the bush, a set of dead black eyes looked back at me, unblinking and not moving. I froze up for a moment, but once my eyes actually focused on it, I saw that it couldn't bring me harm. It was a head of a deer that had spooked me. Just the head. When I actually moved to try to touch it with a gloved hand, it fell forward, revealing the stump of its mauled neck. On top of that, its horns had been completely removed in a similarly messy fashion. Whatever had killed it had done one hell of a job, to say the least. The blood looked somewhat fresh, too. Now, normally, when I see something like that, I turn around pronto, but I had only just made it out there, and the idea of spending the weekend cooped up in my bachelor apartment was enough to outweigh the possibility of being mauled in that moment. Besides, I had my rifle with me, and could easily just set up camp much further away from this little gore site. If something did give trouble, I could just scare it off and hoof it back down the mountain before I could come back for round 2. Most of the logic was there at the time of me making that decision. Along the way, I hadn't seen anything really out of the ordinary. There were a large amount of deer prints in the fresh mud with some possible elk as well. But that by itself couldn't be considered odd when one was this far away from civilization. It still bothered me, but I couldn't quite place my finger as to why yet. Ultimately, I managed to find a good camp spot and spent the first night in my tent watching the little drizzle of rain pour off the canvas and the eventual stars as the clouds parted ways. When morning came, I found another strange discovery. All around my campsite, imprinted in the soft ground, were hoof prints. It wasn't just a couple of them, but damn near hundreds scattered around where I slept. Some of the marks nearly appeared to be on top of each other. First an animal carcass, and now this. It wasn't like deer were known for being very aggressive, though, so perhaps it was just some sort of weird timing. A herd might have been in the area, and what I had seen near my arrival was just one of the poor stragglers that got picked off by something. The start to the morning still left me rather unsettled, though, so I decided that I would spend the day hiking up the nearby ridge, a direction that coincided with the tracks, funnily enough, as I left the campsite, the tracks thinning as I went further and further along. Eventually, I was down to what looked like just an elk and deer that had once walked along there, with one set of tracks following strangely close to one another. As I followed the tracks, I noticed something now as well. Now, when I said I wasn't a hunter, I never meant to say that I didn't have a good eye for detail out in the woods. Alongside these tracks were little speckles of some kind of dark green liquid. It was on the ground, the occasional branch that overlapped with the path, and leaves as well. Wherever it touched, it seemed to spread out and cause rot to the plant life. Really fucking weird to see. I almost touched it, but thought better of it after seeing what it had done to these plants. My guess at the time was that one of the two that left these marks had to have been really sick and this was the leftovers of that. I felt bad for the thing. With my rifle on my back, though, I decided that I'd follow the tracks, as long as they kept with my course, and if I came across the animal, I'd get a good idea of what kind of condition it was in through the scope. If it looked too past gone, I'd put the thing out of its misery. I got my wish one way or another. After another couple hours of hiking, I still hadn't lost the trail. Whenever it petered out, I always seemed to find another sign of it that picked back up again. Then, finally, I spotted the thing. I was heading down the hill when it lifted its head up to look around. It was probably 100 feet or so in front of me, in the clearing with tall grass. Now, from where I was, all I could really make out was its figure. It appeared to be a large elk, at least just from the size of the thing, that had a coat of fur that was off color. It looked almost like moss, it was so green. It also had a massive set of antlers that ended in razor tips that splayed out like branches. One thing I couldn't make out was its head, but that was because it was facing away at the time. Kneeling down, I took my rifle off of my shoulder and set myself up on a stump, letting the body rest on top of it as I peered down my scope and lined it up with the animal. It was when I got a close look at the thing that I realized just how wrong this animal was. Its fur wasn't just an off green, but it was coming off in patches, revealing dead, gray, mottled skin underneath. From these patches, there were occasional gnashes that leaked green ooze onto the grass below. Flies buzzed around the creature and crawled across its body as it moved lazily through the grass. The thing must have been in absolute agony. Seeing something in such a state made my decision easy, and I switched my safety off while lining up for its head. I wanted to get a clean shot to make it as painless as possible, but couldn't until the thing was looking at me. Through the scope, I watched it finally emerge from the tall grass out into a clearing and nearly lost my lunch. It had 8 legs. 4 of them were normal, if not still suffering from those oozing wounds, but the other 4 hung loosely between them with hooves that only made occasional contact with the ground. At that point, I didn't know what the fuck this thing was suffering from, but I could barely stomach looking at it any longer, so I let out a sharp whistle to try to draw its gaze in my direction. The whistle broke through the forest's calm and echoed off of the mountain ridge. The elk's head turned and my heart stopped. What looked back at me didn't even process at first, like when you're looking at an image that just doesn't make sense. Your mind can't make out the shapes because it's rejecting what it's actually looking at. A human skull looked out in my direction, bloody antlers adorning its forehead. It had no skin on it, nor eyes that I could see, only empty sockets that seemed to pierce my very soul. Its mouth. Oh God, its mouth. It had no jaw, and its extended tongue wobbled back and forth as its body swayed. I finally felt my heart start up again, and without even thinking, I pulled the trigger on my gun. With a crack, it fired, and I was sent sprawling back into the dirt. I didn't even look to see if it had hit. I just ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction. When the wind whistled in my ears, all sense of direction vanished as I simply moved my body as fast as I could. Only moments later, though, I could hear it. The sound of thundering hooves close behind and getting closer. My eyes were so tunnel-visioned, though, I failed to keep track of my feet and tripped on an exposed tree root, sending me headfirst down the hill, where I finally came to a stop as I rolled hard into the base of a tree. My head was spinning and my vision was blurred. My legs weren't responding either. All I could do was sit and wait for my vision to come back. I smelt it first before I was able to see it. The stench of death and decay wafted its way towards me and assaulted my nostrils, bringing tears to my eyes as I clamped a hand across my mouth to avoid screaming. When my vision did return, I could see it again. Only 10 feet away now, the thing brought its head down as it approached me slowly. In those empty sockets, I saw something. 2 pinpricks of light that seemed to regard me with dull consideration. Again, my body was locked, so all I could do was sit and stare as it got within 3 feet of me and raised its head up slightly. Now I could see into its mouth. I could see as its tongue was pushed aside and fingers started to wriggle their way free from its throat. First the hand, then the wrist, then the elbow, until a full arm had extended itself out of the creature's mouth towards me. Its skin was as pale as snow, and its nails were blackened and cracked. Gingerly it moved with one finger outstretched until it made contact with my forehead. The last thing I can remember was feeling it drag that nail across my forehead before the world went dark. I was found roughly a week later by search and rescue. Apparently, I had managed to wander back to my campsite and, well, I was catatonic and unresponsive at the time of rescue. I was not any worse than I remember. Apparently, I had managed to wander back to my campsite. And while I was catatonic and unresponsive, at the time of rescue, I was not any worse than I remembered. I had a fractured leg and a nasty cut on my forehead, but was well fed and watered. My memory does not start for at least another week after my rescue. I don't know how I survived in those woods for that week, but I guess that should be the least of my worries at this point. You see, ever since that thing touched me and I regained my consciousness, I have been plagued with the nightmares. Nightmares of butchering, of the wilderness, of a time where civilization has crumbled and all that is left is flesh and bone. That thing is calling to me. It's calling me back to those woods to finish what we had started.
A few things before I begin this story. 1. I was a young, sheltered kid. My parents wouldn't let me watch horror movies until I was about 8 or 9. So I had never seen a scary movie before this story. 2. I have very realistic, vivid dreams, even to this day. It's hard for me to determine whether or not I have dreamt something or actually lived it. So, in this story, it was all real to me. I hadn't realized it was just a dream, or a nightmare, rather. 3. This story could technically be considered a false awakening dream, which, for those of you who may not know, is an extremely realistic dream where the dreamer wakes up within their dream, very Poe-esque, and lives their life, usually normally. Then they wake up for real. Most cases are when people wake up late for work or school or something, and in a panic they hurriedly get ready for their day only to wake up for real moments later. But they can get scary and freaky. Now, to the story. When I was little, between 4 and 6 years old, I took a nap in my great-grandfather's old room in my grandparents' old home. It was an ordinary day, an ordinary nap, nothing strange about that. But it was the dream, the nightmare I had that was so bizarre. I remember the dream very clearly, even to this day. It was extremely vivid, but so real to me, and it was both terrifying and bizarrely amusing at the same time. At the time, I hadn't realized that it was only just a dream. I dreamt that I had woken up in the very same room, on that very same bed. It was daylight out, noontime most likely. The sunlight spilled through the curtains and illuminated the dust floating in the air as it washed over me. For a moment, I didn't know where I was, who I was, or what I was. It was a normal waking after a good, long, midday nap. Then, I felt strange. I felt cold and worried, and anxiety built up within my stomach, and it boiled up into my chest like a heavy flood of fear inside of me. But I didn't know why. Then the room grew dim, like it was evening time or like there was a heavy rain outside. I looked toward the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Then I saw a white thing appearing from below the bed. But before I could see exactly what it was, something inside me told me to run. So I did. I stood to my feet on the bed, and I leapt for the door, which was only about 5 feet from the foot of the bed. But that was a big jump for me. I landed on my hands and knees on the floor, and I tried to stand and round the corner to my right. I figured if I could reach my granny in the kitchen, I'd be safe. She always made me feel safe. Again, I hadn't realized that this was only a dream at the time. It all felt so real to me. Every detail. The warmth of the sunlight, the chill of the fear, the nausea of the anxiety, the wetness of the pee in my pants. As I was struggling to my feet, pushing through the pain in my knees, something compelled me to turn around and look. When I did, all that I saw was a white-gloved hand, and an arm equally as white under the bed. The arm stretched and stretched several feet toward me, and I froze in fear as the hand wrapped tightly around my left ankle. I screamed and cried and peed my pants as it dragged me under the bed, and I was crying for my granny to save me. Then, after the white-gloved hand, which somewhat resembled the gloves that Mickey Mouse wears, dragged me beneath the bed, all the bizarre things began happening. Still, in my head, this was real life. This was not a dream to me. Even at this point, it all felt too real. The heat of the hottest Florida summer, the falling sensation in the pit of my stomach, the pee running down my leg, or filling my pants, rather. It was all real to me. Once I was under the bed, I was above the earth. I was plummeting at terminal velocity toward the ground. I was thousands of feet in the air, and my lungs felt it as I lost my breath for a moment. I screamed, and I couldn't hear myself over the wind in my ears. I felt the hot summer wind whipping through my hair and rushing over my body and through my clothes and drying my pants. I was flipped by the wind, and I looked up to see the bottom of the bed growing smaller and smaller as I fell, the hand waving goodbye from inside the room. When I was flipped back over, I saw a big, black, military helicopter flying below me. I couldn't stop myself, obviously. As I fell between the blades of the helicopter propellers and narrowly missed the body of the chopper, I plummeted a few hundred more feet until I fell through some treetops and landed back in the bed, lying exactly the same way that I was lying when I woke up, in a cold sweat with wet pants, unable to breathe for a moment. It was like you see in the movies, when someone has a nightmare of themselves falling, then they hit their bed in their dream, then wake up and sit straight up in their waking. I've never forgotten that nightmare, and I never will. I remember When I finally woke up for real, I ran to my granny crying in fear and also embarrassment for peeing myself. Granny wasn't mad though. Instead, she consoled me and comforted me, though I never told her what happened in the dream. I felt insane. I didn't understand it. And I felt like I would get in trouble somehow if I told anyone about what happened in the dream. So I just told her it was a nightmare. I was always scared of the underside of beds for years. To this day, I am still somewhat afraid of what's beneath me when I am asleep. Maybe this is the reason for my insomnia. The only difference today, though, is that I don't swan dive onto my bed from the door, or vice versa. But the scariest part about all of this, though, is when I was watching some beginning scenes of It for the first time ever with a friend. No, I don't believe Pennywise is real. I have always wanted to watch It, and so my friend suggested that we should watch it one night when no one was home. I freaked out somewhat when I saw how Pennywise was able to stretch his arms, his white, gloved hands to grab his victims. I had a mini panic attack, and we reluctantly stopped watching it, though I still want to finish the movie. I couldn't sleep last night, and this dream was on my mind, so I figured I'd share it with you. Maybe there's an interpretation to this dream, or maybe it's nothing more than just a frightening nightmare concocted by my always wild and very vivid imagination. Either way, I hope you have sweet dreams tonight.